Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. My name is Melissa Garner, and I'm the Director of Lindamood-Bell for Schools. We're thrilled to have you with us today for our first Leaders in Literacy webinar of the 2018-19 school year. We've got some terrific guests lined up for the coming year, and today is no exception. I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker, the Honorable Robert Pasternack. Dr. Pasternack is the former Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Ed and Rehabilitative Services in the U.S. Department of Education. He served President Bush from 2001 and 2004 and was a member of the President's Commission on Excellence in Special Ed, as well as the President's Mental Health Commission. A former teacher, school psychologist, superintendent, and state director of special ed, Dr. Pasternack has been working with children with disabilities and their families for more than 40 years. He has been recognized for his expertise on a number of education-related areas and has provided expert testimony before the U.S. Congress on multiple occasions on the improvement of special ed services, the empowerment of individuals with disabilities in public education, as well as the importance of teacher preparedness. We are truly honored to have him here with us today. Can't thank him enough. Over to you, Dr. Pasternack.
Hello. Thanks, Melissa, for that lovely introduction and for the gracious invitation extended by Lindamood-Bell to participate in this series of discussions preceding and during the 2018-19 school year, which will soon be upon us. What I'd like to do during this presentation is talk a little bit about the history of special education, where we are currently in special education, and where we need to go in the future for students with disabilities and their families. Without further ado, I'm going to have this slides to kind of help guide the discussion and my comments on the slides that I'll be sharing with you. So in 1967, as you can see from this first slide, almost 200,000 individuals with significant disabilities were in state institutions, many of which provided only minimal food, clothing, and shelter. Since this probably be my last opportunity to do something like this, I'll quickly share that my brother, may he rest in peace, was one of those individuals in an institution. Maurice was born with Down syndrome, died about 12 years ago at the age of 63. He started out his life in an institution on Staten Island called Willowbrook. And when Geraldo Rivera was a real journalist, snuck a camera in there, surreptitiously took a series of pictures documenting the deplorable way that we treated individuals with disabilities, warehoused, abused, mistreated, segregated those individuals. Those pictures found their way to Burton Blatt, who was a professor at Syracuse University in New York. Burton wanted to publish those pictures or have a publisher publish those pictures, could not find a publisher to publish those pictures. And so what Burton did is with his own money, he published those pictures. And the book was called A Christmas in Purgatory. And it was a photo essay documenting the deplorable way that we treated individuals with disabilities and institutionalized them and warehoused them and segregated them, abused and mistreated them. And thankfully, those kinds of things have by and large improved dramatically in the time since. So in 1970, our schools across the country were only educating 1 in 5 of our kids with disabilities, and many states had laws excluding kids who were deaf, blind, emotionally disturbed, or intellectually disabled from receiving the free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment that they are now entitled to receive since 1975, when federal law providing civil rights protections to students with disabilities and their families was first signed and put into law. This next slide just quickly shows the amount of responsibilities that we're putting on our teachers. And NEA just released a study a couple of weeks ago showing how stressed out our teachers are given the incredible responsibilities and the difficult job that we ask them to do in educating all of our 50+ million students every day in America's public schools. And teaching is a very hard job, and I want to make sure to say that I am grateful that every day in America great things happen for all of our kids, including kids with disabilities, because caring, dedicated, committed professionals show up to do the difficult work that we ask them to do across the country. Obviously, it wouldn't be I'd be remiss if I didn't at least talk about some of the issues that are currently going on in our country that relate to public schools. Unfortunately, with the number of school shootings that we've had and the focus on school safety, there's been some discussion about whether teachers should be armed, and I'll leave that up to the viewers to make their own decision about whether that's a good thing or not. I certainly don't think that we should be giving teachers guns, but that's what this cartoon certainly illustrates, that the teacher would prefer textbooks and computers and pencils. And you all know about the teachers paying out of their own pockets for the supplies that they need to use with their students, and certainly we don't pay our teachers in America what they deserve. And you've seen strikes in several states across the country, beginning in West Virginia, where teachers are becoming much more strident and vocal about the fact that they are underpaid. Certainly, if we arm our teachers, there's some hypotheses that the kids will be forced to learn because teachers will shoot them if they don't learn. I want to talk very briefly about some of the politics of distraction, as John Hattie describes it, or things that we have done in education and special ed that have not worked. Clearly, a lot of the instructional models that we're using across the country are not working. And unfortunately, special education is not special for the vast majority of students who are receiving special education and related services. I'll show some data in a bit that will dramatize that and document the fact that students with disabilities are not, in fact, making the kind of progress that we would like them to make. And in large part, it's because we are using instructional models that do not work. And clearly, the efficacy demonstrated by Lindamood-Bell is an example of the kind of instructional approach that folks should be using in our schools in order to make sure that students with disabilities get the specially designed instruction that they're entitled to receive under the law. We focus way too much in the past on process versus outcome. Clear examples are things like easiest way to describe that is using something like visual motor integration, where we use the Bender Gestalt or the developmental test of visual motor integration, VMI, and got kids to draw. Kids didn't draw very well. We said that they had a processing deficit in visual motor integration, provided some interventions. They got better in that particular area. And what did not happen is that the improvement in visual motor integration did not generalize over to improving their reading skills. And yes, the number one reason why kids get referred to special education is reading. The number two reason why kids get referred to special education across the country is for behavior problems. And the number one reason why kids have behavior problems is, yes, they can't read. So the focus on literacy and reading by programs, again, like Lindamood-Bell, recognizes the seminal role of reading in education and the critical importance of teaching kids to read. Some of you may know that we worked very hard in the reauthorization of IDEA in 2004 to, for the first time in the history of IDEA since 1975, get language on RTI, response to intervention or response to instruction and intervention into federal law. And the President's Commission on Excellence in Special Education, which was the first time in the history of the United States that there was a presidential commission to study special education, saved some of its strongest language and said, quote, we need to drive a stake through the heart for the way that we identify students with learning disabilities, unquote. And that was a recognition of the fact that the IQ achievement discrepancy model is flawed, is not scientifically based, is not the way that we should be identifying students with specific learning disabilities. And in fact, we need to replace that with the use of a model like response to intervention, or RTI. Other things like vestibular stimulation, which was made famous by Jean Ayres, OT as a treatment approach for students with autism before we talked about the ASD and the spectrum, and things like auditory discrimination that I've talked about over the years, where we, again, examples of things that we have focused on that clearly were not evidence-based and did not result in the kinds of growth academically and behaviorally that we wanted to see in students with disabilities. In 1975, Congress passed and President Gerald Ford signed Public Law 94-142. And there were four purposes of the act when President Ford signed it. And just as I said at the outset, talking just briefly about the history of special education, I want to remind folks that President Ford was set to veto Public Law 94-142. He had his veto message written, and we talked him out of vetoing the bill. But the reason that President Ford was going to veto Public Law 94-142 was his belief that the American public school community would never see the realization of the promise made in the law that public schools would receive 40% of the excess costs incurred in providing specially designed instruction and related services to what we used to call handicapped kids, what we now call kids with disabilities. And lo and behold, 43 years since the passage of Public Law 94-142, it turns out that President Ford was prescient and absolutely correct. And as administrators know, the federal contribution is about 16% rather than anywhere close to the 40%. And quite frankly, we don't know how much money is really being spent on special education, because the majority of money that's spent is state and local money. We know how much the feds are providing, but the federal contribution is nowhere close to the 40% that was promised back in 1975. And just to remind you all that there has not been a study of how much money is being spent on special education across the United States in 16 years. So we really don't know how much is being spent. A lot of people will say that there's not enough money being spent. My opinion, quite frankly, is that there's a great deal of money being spent. It's just being spent on the wrong kids. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. But imagine, as a special ed administrator, how much different your budgeting would be if you reduced inappropriate referrals to special ed, and the 80% of students with disabilities, with mild disabilities, were served in a enriched general education setting with teachers who were providing evidence-based interventions to kids who were struggling. And then you would dramatically reduce the number of students who are receiving special education. And if you had the same amount of money that you have now, how much more you would have to be able to spend on kids with disabilities if you could actually reduce inappropriate referrals to special education. Anyway, going back to the four purposes of Public Law 94-142, number one was to assure that all children with disabilities have available free, appropriate public education, which emphasizes special ed and related services designed to meet their unique needs. Some of you, many of you may know the acronym FAPE, but Free Appropriate Public Education in the Least Restrictive Environment, something that has been one of the civil rights guarantees of Public Law 94-142. 94-142 since its inception. Secondly was to assure that the rights of children with disabilities and their parents are protected. Parents fought very hard to get Public Law 94-142 passed and signed, and continue to be tireless advocates for their kids. And we need to respect that. We need to understand how much stress having a child with a disability puts on the family system. There's been documentation for many years about the fact that families who have a child with a disability in it have higher divorce rates than families that do not have children with disabilities. And so and families will absolutely talk to you about the challenges that they face in living with a child with a disability. Third is, and by the way, I think it's incumbent on us in education and special ed to be partners with families of students with disabilities and families with all children, with all students. And I think we clearly are working hard in many places to make that a reality. The third purpose is to assist states and localities to provide for the education of all children with disabilities. Some of you may be familiar with the concept of child find, where schools have to document their efforts to identify all children with disabilities, birth through 21, in the community, and provide services to those children and their families. IDEA is unique in providing services birth through 21. There's Part C that provides services to kids birth through 3, Section 619 of IDEA, which provides services to kids who are 3 and 4 years of age, and then Part B, which provides services to school-age kids. The best money that we spend in education, according to folks like Jim Heckman, who's a Nobel Prize-winning economist in Chicago, is on early intervention and pre-K. And places like Los Angeles Unified School District, the second largest school district in America, provides in their programs that provide services to kids who are 3 and 4 years of age, who have individualized family services plan, IFSP. 46% of the kids who were 3 and 4 years of age who were enrolled in their high quality effective pre-K programs did not need special education when they got out of those high quality effective preschool programs. So the concept of preventing kids having disabilities, the concept of intervening early when kids are having problems and changing their trajectory so that they do not need special education, which in fact is not special for the vast majority of students who receive special education, is critically important and can be done. And LAUSD should be commended, and I commend them for the great work that they've been doing. And that has led to the genesis of something called Pay for Success, which is a model that started in Granite, Utah, where Goldman Sachs invested $8 million in their pre-K program, and Goldman Sachs was to be repaid based on reducing referrals to special education. Well, the data from that program have scared some advocates in that the reduction in referrals to special education from that preschool program has been 100%. There have been no referrals from that highly effective pre-K program in Utah. And in fact, Goldman Sachs has been repaid because of the money saved in students not needing special ed when they got out of that pre-K program and went into the K through 12 system. So that program and model is so effective that it's now been codified, and Pay for Success is one of the things that is included in the ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which you all know is the current version of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965 that was previously called No Child Left Behind when President Bush was in office. And then the last purpose, which really has taken precedence and has now been the focus of work from the U.S. Department of Education has been to assess and assure the effectiveness of efforts to educate all children with disabilities. In other words, focusing on compliance is important. However, it is not as important as focusing on data to show whether, in fact, special ed is effective and whether students with disabilities are improving and growing and showing increases in academic achievement. So that is just an overview of the four purposes. Now let's move from where we were to where we are. Where are we now? Well, about 60% of students with disabilities spend 80% or more of their day in general education. Many of you may be familiar with the term inclusion, and unfortunately, the metric has been where the student is sitting and not what is happening with that student. And yes, we can document that the majority of students with disabilities are spending most of their time in general education setting. However, most recent data that I have seen suggests that only 23% of general education teachers feel adequately prepared to accommodate students with disabilities in their general education classrooms. So in other words, teachers in general that say this kid is a pain in the ass, I want this kid out of my class. They refer the kid to the child study team or variation of that exists at the district level. Perhaps winding up in the student receiving the comprehensive multidisciplinary evaluation that the child is entitled to receive to determine the child's eligibility for special ed. The child is labeled, the child is one of the 13 categories of eligibility for special ed, but then the district says, okay, we believe in inclusion, and then they go ahead and put that same student right back in the classroom with the teacher who was intent on getting that kid out of his or her class. So we do know where these kids are sitting, but we really don't know enough about what is happening with these kids, and that is one of the many things that I find troubling as I look towards the future of where we need to go in special ed. Clearly we need to do a better job with teacher preparation. And one of the things that we need to improve is giving general ed teachers better tools to be able to accommodate students with disabilities if in fact we continue this trend to put students with disabilities in general education classes because that is by default the least restrictive environment. And if we want kids to be in a general ed environment, that's great philosophically, but it needs to translate into making sure that the kids are getting the free, appropriate public education in that environment, and that requires that the teachers have the skills that they need to do the difficult job of working with those kids when they are in their classes. And anyway, and as I said earlier about the importance of early intervention, we've got the 350,000 infants and toddlers across the country receiving those services in Part C. Many of those programs are operated by the Departments of Health in the state, but yet it remains a critically important a part of IDEA and allows us to get to these kids at birth and very early on in their lives and work with the families, because any of you who work in those programs know there's something, it's not called an IEP, it's called the IFSP, the Individualized Family Services Plan. So there's really a focus on the family. Many of these programs make home visits, and so there's a great opportunity to really do important work with partnership with the family. And we could talk about the number of kids who are receiving special ed across the United States. These are the most current data that just came out last week. And in preparation for today's webinar, I wanted to make sure that you all had access to the most current data available. And you will see that the category of specific learning disability continues to be the largest of the 13 categories of eligibility for students receiving special ed across the United States. Yes, a disorder, one of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or using spoken or written language that manifests itself in an imperfect ability to listen, read, write, do math. There are 8 different kinds of learning disabilities, but the majority of students who are in the category of SLD are there because they can't read. One of those terms that is used in that category is a term of dyslexia, and many of you, I'm sure, who are familiar with Lindamood-Bell know their incredible success and track record of working with kids and adults with dyslexia, lifelong pervasive disabilities, word blindness, real challenges in reading at the word level and being able to then comprehend when kids really do have dyslexia. The problem is that we've got many kids in the category of specific learning disability who are not kids with specific learning disabilities. They are, in fact, not kids with SLD or specific learning disabilities, as I refer to them as they are ABT, which stands for they ain't been taught. And these are kids who have not had access to evidence-based practices deployed by effective teachers with fidelity and treatment integrity. And these are kids that could have learned to read if they had been taught. And they're not kids with a specific learning disability. And I think it's really important as we move forward to do a better job of differentiating between those kids that have a specific learning disability and those kids who are instructional casualties and victims of poor instruction, or they ain't been taught. And we have not done as good a job as we should. I will remind you all that since, I'll get to that actually later on. Speech and language impairment is the next highest group of students with disabilities receiving special ed. You got 20% of the kids with disabilities receiving special ed in that category. Then OHI, or the health impairment, which is one of the categories that actually has increased in recent years. Because in 1997, as some of you may know, IDEA was amended. It was not reauthorized. And one of the amendments that was made was to allow students with ADD, attention deficit disorder, or ADHD, attention deficit with hyperactivity disorder, to be determined eligible for special ed in the category of OHI, or other health impairment. Clearly, we've seen the biggest growth in terms of any category out of the 13 in the category of autism. The incidence prevalence rate for students with autism in our lifetimes has changed from 1 in 1,500 to the most recent data suggesting that the number is now 1 in 58. And this is just a remarkable change and has led to just a huge increase in the number of students being identified on the spectrum. And even though in the DSM Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, DSM-5, Asperger's is no longer a category in that revision of the DSM, yet there's still this dramatic increase in the number of kids in the spectrum. And I think some would argue that our definition of normal is shrinking and our definition of abnormal is growing. And are we overdiagnosing students in the category of ASD? I will leave that up to you to decide, but clearly some of us think that that is in fact occurring. There's now, I would just very quickly say that my first job working with kids with disabilities was in 1970, almost 50 years ago. Yeah, I am old. And those were kids with autism, and it was in an institute when we still had institutions in Florida. It was in an institutional setting, and those kids are different than the kinds of kids that we now see in some classes where we're calling kids with autism. And you know, there's terms that are being used like mild autism. To me, that's like being a little bit pregnant. You know, does a kid really have autism, or does a kid not have autism? We certainly have disputes about the etiology of autism, what's causing this. Some describe it an epidemic of students with autism, but nonetheless, huge challenges for school districts in terms of the increase in the number of students in that category and how to provide services to those kids and their families. And then you can see the others that are there. But if you look at just SLD, specific learning disability, speech and language impairment, other health impairment, developmental delay, which is for young kids under the age of 9, which is an option to some states whether they use that or not. Kids with ED, you do the math, but we're looking at perhaps 80% of the students are currently receiving special education as being kids with mild disabilities. The overwhelming majority of students receiving special ed are, in fact, those kids with mild disabilities, as you can see from the most recent data. These data just were published by the National Center for Education Statistics, and you certainly feel free to look them up on your own. And this is another way of looking at those categories. This slide shows the data indicating a decrease in the number of students that we used to call mental retardation, what we now call cognitive and intellectually disabled, significantly sub-average general intellectual functioning originating in the developmental period associated with impaired adaptive behavior. Those kids in that category has gone down while we've seen this concomitant significant increase in the number of kids with autism in that category. Now I want to share some good news that I really I'm happy to share with you. And some people do not find this good news because they believe that we ought to be identifying more students as needing special education. Since 2004, with the inclusion of RTI language in federal law for the first time in history, we have seen an 18% reduction in the number of students in the category of specific learning disability. And some people say, well, what you're doing is you're just moving kids from one category to another. And in fact, what we have found is that there was during that same time period, there was an overall 6% reduction in the number of students receiving special education. Now, that is really about trying to intervene early. It is about strengthening the provision of evidence-based interventions in general education settings. These are all critically important issues that have resulted in this reduction of students in the category of specific learning disabilities and overall in students being inappropriately identified as having a disability when in fact they are struggling for reasons that are not related to their having a disability, and they are therefore not eligible for special education and should not be placed in special education. Unfortunately, the most recent data that I alluded to a minute ago that just came out last week have indicated a recent increase in the number of students receiving special education across the country. So while this trend was something that we were very excited about and really attributed to the fact that people were embracing this construct of response to intervention and trying to look at tiers of more comprehensiveness, individualization, frequent progress monitoring as kids move from tier 1, which was all kids, to tier 2, which was for some kids where they were receiving small group interventions, and then tier 3, which was for few kids, meant that they were getting even more frequent progress monitoring, more individualization, more comprehensiveness, direct, systematic, explicit instruction, the better pedagogy, better methodology, and better monitoring of their progress. All of that, the 3-tiered model, was an attempt to give kids interventions to prevent them from being inappropriately identified as having a disability and being incorrectly determined to be eligible for special education. And quite frankly, that was working. and I hope will continue to work as we move forward. And these slides just are different ways of portraying what I've been talking to you about. And you can see on this slide that the number of kids with autism in the spectrum has grown by 165% in the decade between the 05-06 and the 14-15 school years. Other health impaired also increased, as I said a minute ago, and that increase is fueled by the number of kids who are identified as having ADHD. And then you can see that the good news that I was talking about earlier in terms of specific learning disabilities being reduced by 17-18%, kids with emotional disturbance being reduced, speech and language impairments being reduced, cognitive and intellectual disabilities also being reduced. So, okay. Now, as I said a minute ago, the federal government says to the states that the states must ensure or shall ensure that school districts are in fact complying with IDEA. So these activities that the federal government requires the states to do when they monitor what's going on at the local district level, the focus is really on, or should be on, and the department has been working hard to put the focus on improving educational results and functional outcomes for children with disabilities, and ensuring that the states meet program requirements with emphasis on those activities and requirements most related to improving results. So how are the results doing? So we have seen just the good news, bad news kind of thing. The good news is that in fact, students with disabilities are having their transition plans done in a timely basis, and that they are transitioning from pre-K or Part C to the 619, the 3 and 4 year old programs, and then from 3 and 4 year old programs to K-12 programs. That those data indicate that that activity is in fact happening across the country. When we talk about the transition, by the way, from kids with disabilities from school to post-school, the news is not that good. And I just will remind you all that the last census showed that the largest subgroup of American citizens was the subgroup of adults with disabilities, or people with disabilities. There were 56 million individuals with disabilities in the United States, making it the largest subgroup of American citizens. And the unemployment rate for adults with disabilities is 70%. So while working very hard to get kids graduated, either with a standard diploma or a modified diploma, the post-school outcomes for students with disabilities are atrocious. And we need to do a better job of working with the business community to, in fact, get them to rely less on sympathy and pity and compassion, and more on the fact that people with disabilities make great employees. They're reliable, they're dependable, they show up on time, they have lower attrition rates, and those are the kinds of reasons why businesses should be hiring individuals with disabilities. And hopefully, as I said, when we look to the future, we can do a better job of increasing the employment rate for adults with disabilities. And of course, we want to make sure that the kids can read when they leave school, so therefore they will have a better time of being able to read the material that they need to read in order to be successful when they get competitive, meaningful, integrated employment. The data that states are submitting to the U.S. Department of Education has gotten more accurate, and you can see the percentage has improved there. More good news. There's a time limit on the amount of time that state departments of education can take to resolve a complaint. when they receive a complaint from typically from parents, and those complaints are being resolved in a timely manner, and there actually has been a reduction in the number of cases that are being litigated regarding students with disabilities. And some of us, including myself, believe that the money that we spend in the courtroom is money that we can't spend in the classroom, and that we need to really work hard to reduce litigation, and we should be celebrating the fact that there are less complaints being filed. I'm going to talk about an important litigation here in a minute. And the amount of time that elapses between a referral and evaluation has improved, has been reduced. So states are doing a good job, by and large, in trying to make sure that the districts in those states do evaluate students for possible eligibility in special education when they are referred. That trend has been good to see, and I think folks are very concerned about whether that trend is going to continue looking to the future, because we currently have a critical shortage across the country in school psychologists, and because school psychologists are the ones that typically lead the comprehensive multidisciplinary evaluation team and conduct a part of that evaluation, there's some concern whether that trend will continue, but the news is good in terms of looking at it now, that kids are being evaluated in a timely manner when they're being referred. Now, for the bad news, the reason it's so important for me to share these data with you, and this slide and the few that you'll see after this, is that I would just challenge folks to tell me why they think special ed is special for the vast majority of students who are receiving special education, looking at the data that you see on this slide. When you see that academic achievement has been stagnant for students with disabilities, and you look at the last administration of the NAEP, we know that the NAEP is given every other year to samples of 4th, 8th, and 12th graders, the National Assessment of Education Progress, often called the gold standard in evaluation. And you look at the fact that students with disabilities are stagnant in terms of their performance on the NAEP, and that the gap between students with disabilities and their non-disabled peers is the largest in history on the last 2017 administration of the NAEP. So those things support my belief that special ed is not so special, and that why aren't kids getting the specially designed instruction that they're entitled to receive? And let me dramatize that even further by showing you this slide. These data are from the National Longitudinal Transition Study, which is a federally mandated study of special ed that is done every decade. And when you look at these data are for kids that spend their academic career in special education. Sadly, most kids remain in special education until either they drop out or age out, or they get a diploma or some modified version of a diploma, depending on which state they're in. But you see from these data that 45% of the kids, the area that's in green on this slide, 45% of the kids with disabilities, when they leave special education, are still 3 to 5 grade levels behind. And 20%, or 1 out of 5, are 5 or more grade levels behind. So how can we argue that special ed is so special when we see these data that document that, in fact, kids are not making the kind of growth that they should be making, and that they are not experiencing the kinds of outcomes. And just now, probably as good a time as any, to talk for a minute about the recent unanimous Supreme Court ruling from this past term in the Andrew decision. Andrew case came from Colorado. was a case of a kid with autism where the parents thought that the school district was not providing the free appropriate public education. They pulled the kid out. They sent the kid to a private program. Anyway, in the interest of making this a short discussion about Andrew, the Supreme Court, when the case finally got there, ruled unanimously that students with disabilities are entitled to receive more than the legal terminology is the de minimis, or a minimal educational benefit that students with disabilities have historically been receiving. And yes, I'm proud to be part of an amicus brief that was submitted by the Bazelon Center with some other colleagues, arguing that in support of the need to support the need that students with disabilities should be getting more than minimal educational benefit that they historically have been getting. And you look at these data, and it makes the case that students with disabilities are not getting the kind of educational benefit that they should be getting from spending their lifetime in special education. And we know that the dropout rate for students with disabilities is twice the dropout rate for non-disabled students, and that the exit rate of students with disabilities from special ed across the country is less than 5%. So when we began special ed, and the idea was get the kid in, remediate the disability, a term we don't even hear very much anymore, and then the student was to be out of special education, supposed to be a revolving door, in fact has not lived up to that promise, and it's become a trapdoor. The kids get in and they never get out, and clearly you can see these data, which are the reading data, that indicate that students with disabilities are not, in fact, getting the kind of educational benefit that they should be getting. And now the Supreme Court has mandated that students with disabilities across the country must get more than the minimal educational benefit that they have previously been receiving. And the challenge for the future for educators and special educators is to figure out how to do that. How are we going to identify and provide evidence-based practices that are going to go ahead and allow us to ensure that kids with disabilities get that more than the minimal educational benefit that they've historically been receiving. And that really gets to the poor state of teacher preparation that we have around the United States. I'm privileged to be on the board of the National Center for Teacher Quality. We look at the quality of teacher preparation across the United States. It's a nonprofit, nctq.org. You can go there and look at the recent data. We look at about 750 colleges and universities across the country. And sadly, too many teachers who go to these, and let me just say that, yes, there are some excellent teacher preparation programs across the United States. However, there are too many teacher preparations that are doing a terrible job of preparing teachers for the difficult job that we ask them to do. And what we find, which is very troubling, is that special ed teachers get less training on how to teach reading than their general education counterparts. So what we've done in the past is say, oh, the kid is struggling in reading, let's take the kid out of the general ed classroom and send that kid down the hall to the special education teacher. And what we are doing is taking the kid away from a teacher who's had more training on how to teach reading, sending that kid to a teacher who's had less training on how to teach reading. And that's why we see the kinds of data that I'm sharing with you now. It's not special. And so we really need to do a better job of training all of our teachers. And that's why we waste so much money on professional development that is not high quality, ongoing, job embedded, sustained, effective, and don't focus on the kinds of things that work. And we've got too many people deploying practices that are not evidence-based, that are not effective, spend way too much money on things that do not work, and evidenced by the fact that our kids are not making the kinds of progress that they should be making and are now required to make under the Andrew decision. So it will be very interesting as we move forward to see the impact of that decision. There was just a case that just came out from the Fourth Circuit, which is the first one that I have seen, where the court invoked the Supreme Court Andrew decision as a way of remanding the case back to the district court, saying that the court needed to consider the Andrew decision in making its judgment. And I think we'll be seeing more and more of those. I'm not a lawyer, don't play one on TV, and yeah, we got too many lawyers involved in special ed, but I think the Supreme Court should be commended for making that decision. You've all seen very few unanimous decisions from the court this term, and so it was really give you a sense of how important that decision is and was, that it came out unanimously from the court, and now is the law of the land. Those were the reading data, and I'll just quickly show you the math data. They're no better. People who bifurcate reading and math really don't understand that the way we measure math, in large part, is give kids word problems. So if kids can't read, they can't be successful in math. And again, it goes back to just the critical importance of getting kids to learn how to read, and why programs like Lindamood-Bell are so important in folks being able to identify highly effective practices, evidence-based practices with data to support their efficacy, so that it's not open to interpretation. Programs that actually work and make a difference in the lives of the kids that we care so much about and work so hard to help. And just to end, to show you that the academic outcomes and the growth made by students who spend their academic careers in special education are in fact no better in the area of math than they are in the area of reading. And so what it does is to hopefully make the case for you all, which I have said redundantly, repetitively during this webinar, and that is that special ed is not so special for the vast majority of students who are receiving special education. So let's reduce inappropriate referrals to special ed, let's strengthen general education, let's provide evidence-based practices deployed by effective teachers with fidelity and treatment integrity, and then we'll see the kind of growth and progress that for all kids, including kids with disabilities, that they should be making and they're entitled to make under federal law. So I talked about the NAEP, and I think just to end the webinar for today is that what we focus on is what improves. So there are not enough resources out there to pay attention to everything, so we have to prioritize. And what should our priorities be moving forward? Our priorities should be on reducing inappropriate referrals to special ed, early intervention, beginning in pre-K programs with effective pre-K programs that can change your kids' trajectories from risk to resiliency, as evidenced by the LAUSD data that I shared with you earlier and the Pay for Success model out of Granite, Utah. And then when we do decide that a student has a disability and does need special education, to make sure that via the Andrew decision that the kid gets maximum educational benefit. When we looked at the President's Commission on Excellence in Special Education, as I shared with you at the beginning with the history of special ed, the problem originally was access. Kids with disabilities did not have access to free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. We fixed that with the tireless advocacy of parents and the work done by educators and leaders across the country. Kids with disabilities have access. Now the challenge is excellence. How are we going to make sure that we afford these kids the kinds of educational programs that will result in their receiving an excellent education and share the outcomes to prove that they have in fact had an excellent educational experience. As I said repeatedly, we need to focus on results and outcomes and growth, and the accountability system must be designed to drive desirable behaviors and best practices among all stakeholders. In other words, intelligent accountability, where if districts are doing well, let's leave them alone, make them beacons for other districts to emulate, and where districts are struggling, we ought to focus our attention and our resources on them, and not continue politics of distraction by moaning about class size and saying that if we reduce class size, we'd have better outcomes and results. There are no data to suggest that reducing class size is the panacea. And those kinds of things that we continue to misguidedly believe are going to make a difference, we need to recognize that those are not the things that we need to be paying attention to. We need to be paying attention to those programs that work, what works best for our kids, and implement those kinds of programs. And I hope that's what you will all be doing during the 2018-19 school year. Thank you very much for your time and for the opportunity to be with you on this webinar. And thanks again to the great folks at Lindamood-Bell for their gracious invitation.
Hey, thanks again, Bob. It was always great to have you, and I really appreciate all of the candor and information you passed along to everyone. I think all of us here anecdotally see what you described all the time, and so it's really great with someone with your expertise to essentially validate what we see all the time. So thanks again for your time, and it was truly an honor to have you.